presentation. I think everyone's still with me here. So, the future belongs to those who build it. Pipelines Energy and a blueprint for Canada's future. On July 20th, 1871, British Columbia became the 6th province to sign on to the audacious vision that was Canada, as laid out by the Fathers of Confederation. A vision that was as bold as it was courageous. To create a new nation, one that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, through the Rockies and across the prairies. To unite the small, disparate, and at the time insignificant colonies of what remained of British North America in what was perhaps the greatest nation-building project the world had ever seen. Over a century and a half later, much of our prosperity, identity, and independence we owe to them and those who followed in their footsteps. They built this country, literally, from the ground up. From the National Railway through 2 World Wars, their determination and perseverance shaped not only the land around them, but also the people who called it home. What has happened to that tenacity, that resolve, that fortitude? Where are our leaders, our statesmen for a new century? Those who can live up to the lions of Canadian Confederation, like Wilfrid Laurier, John A. Macdonald, and George Etienne Cartier. Who is the author of Canada's next chapter? Surely we can do better than our current Prime Minister. But to do so, we really need to rediscover that boldness and audacity that built this country and couple it with a vision befitting a nation as vast and burgeoning with potential as our own. But before we can do that as conservatives, and I think most of us are conservatives here, are conservative, we need to take a moment of self-reflection. The truth is, the modern conservative movement in this country all too often struggles to articulate its vision for Canada and its future, seemingly content with merely slowing the onslaught of liberalism rather than presenting a true alternative to the Canadian people. In fact, there is nothing this country needs more right now than a tried and true conservative vision. A vision that starts with getting back to the basics, with building this country. In the late 1800s, Canada was a small country, divided by language and surrounded by a larger, much more powerful neighbor to the south. Yet in that historical context, we completed what many consider this country's greatest political and engineering feat, the Canadian Pacific Railway. Today, we can't even build a frickin' pipeline. And the consequences of this are very, very real. Our lack of market access forces us to sell our oil at a massive discount to the Americans. A reality that costs us tens of thousands of jobs and over $60 million each day or $20 billion each year, depending on what the differential is at. That's money that could have gone into providing valuable government services like healthcare and education, to building schools and hospitals, to supporting our vets. Instead, it's been completely wasted. Think about how ridiculous this is. Canada has the 3rd largest reserves of oil on the entire planet. Yet we are still importing oil from countries like Saudi Arabia, countries that threaten Canada directly, repress women, and murder journalists. What are we doing? We have the oil. We have the know-how. We have the skill and determination of the Canadian people. All we're missing are the politicians with the courage and vision to get the job done. And to be clear, the world needs more energy. It needs it today, and it will need it tomorrow. The fact is, the International Energy Agency predicts energy demand will increase 32% by 2040, with more than a quarter of that total energy demand growth coming in the form of oil. The problem is that increase in demand is concentrated in Asian markets, particularly in China and India, where demand for oil is expected to increase 37% and 154% respectively. markets that, without pipelines, Canada has little to no access to. Today, 99% of our country's oil exports are sold to one country, the United States. But make no mistake, if Canadian oil stays in the ground, which, by the way, is the true objective of the radical eco-activists by their own admission, those investment dollars will go elsewhere. Those jobs will go elsewhere. They will go to brutal, repressive regimes like Venezuela and Iran. They will go toward funding those governments' priorities, like the repression of peaceful dissent and the export of terrorism, instead of our own. And the truth is, no one does safety and environmental stewardship better than Canada and better than Canadians. And as long as the world needs and demands oil, and until that final barrel is lifted from the ground, as much of that oil as possible should come from Canada. And that starts with building pipelines. That starts with building not only the Trans Mountain expansion, but Northern Gateway as well. So our resources can reach new markets and new customers, so we can finally end the US monopoly on Canadian oil. That starts with building Energy East, refining Canadian oil in Canadian refineries and achieving true energy independence. But instead of showing leadership, instead of following in the nation-building footsteps of those who built this country, the federal government has done the exact opposite. First, they axed Northern Gateway without so much as a coherent explanation. Then they sat back and watched as the NDP government bullied Kinder Morgan into submission, forcing taxpayers to bail out a pipeline that had only become essential because the government had just torpedoed its only other alternative. What kind of country are we if a private company that wants to invest billions into Canada receives all the legal approvals they need from the government and the NEB, and yet is still forced to abandon the project? What does this do to Canada's reputation as a place to invest, as a place where government approvals actually mean something? And now, 3 unelected judges with no background in oil and gas have delayed the project again, all because of a hypothetical, unsubstantiated risk to whales and the incomprehensible conclusion that nearly a decade of quote-unquote consulting with Indigenous communities wasn't enough, even though a majority of First Nations along the pipeline route actually support the project. At a certain point, we must decide if we live in a democracy comprised of grown-ups where people vote and elect governments to act on their behalf, or we live in a banana republic where investors can't rely on anything the government says or does, and radical minorities, be they judges or activists, dictate the nation's public policy to everybody else. And to be clear, the Trans Mountain expansion should be a no-brainer. It's an expansion of an existing pipeline that has already operated safely for over 60 years, during which time there hasn't been a single maritime incident, not a single one. In fact, despite constant tanker traffic that all of a sudden everybody's freaking out about, the only serious oil spill on BC's west coast originated not from an oil tanker, but a BC's ferries vessel that ran aground near Prince Rupert. And in case anyone's been living under a rock, there's a gas shortage here in BC. And it just so happens the existing Trans Mountain pipeline is one of the few pipelines in the world that can actually ship refined products like gasoline, which it already does. Together with the crude oil it supplies to the Parkland refinery in Burnaby, supplying the majority of British Columbia's gasoline and diesel. But instead of supporting the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion that could help deliver more refined products to the region, the provincial government in Victoria has done everything in its power to derail it entirely, pissing off Alberta, instigating a mini constitutional crisis, and running the risk that new Premier Jason Kenney could turn off the taps entirely, and to be honest, I wouldn't blame him. It continues a trend of this government pursuing ideological solutions over common sense results. A series of decisions that, instead of making BC more affordable like they promised, have made the province an even more expensive place to call home. And the governor of Washington State, who I like to talk about, Jay Inslee, is actually, if it's possible, even worse. An individual who said that he'll do everything he can to stop the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. He's also running for president, by the way, now. He's at about 1% in the polls that are generous to him. I honestly don't even know where to begin, but let's start with his colossal hypocrisy. Washington State is home to not one, not two, but 5 large refineries that receive a majority of their oil from hundreds of tankers transiting the exact same bodies of water that he's spontaneously concerned about. And any oil they don't receive by tanker, they actually receive by pipeline, the existing Trans Mountain Pipeline, which diverts partially to Washington State at the city of Sumas. But if the blatant hypocrisy isn't enough, how about the simple fact that this pipeline is entirely in Canada, it's carrying Canadian oil, and is now actually owned by Canadian taxpayers, and maybe the governor should just mind his own business. And when Mr. Inslee says he, quote, stands with the people of British Columbia in opposition to the project, well, with all due respect to the governor, no, he doesn't. Poll after poll has shown a large majority of British Columbians and a large majority of Canadians, and for some reason this narrative is lost in the media, actually support the project. And yet, even if the federal government manages to get the Trans Mountain expansion completely built in some reasonable amount of time, which I think is highly doubtable, the prospect of getting any of the other pipelines built that are so desperately needed in this country is unlikely, to say the least. Bill C-69, currently before the Senate, and otherwise known as the quote-unquote No More Pipelines Bill, will make it even more difficult, if that's even possible, to develop our resources and power our economy, increasing regulatory complexity, creating additional barriers to investment, and putting even more Canadian jobs at risk. And it's not just in oil and gas. Other industries like mining, like forestry, and even port expansions will also be affected. Think about this. If you were a major oil and gas company based in Canada, in the United States, anywhere in the world, to be frank, why would you even consider investing in the Canadian economy right now, particularly oil and gas, when you can just as easily invest in the United States in that exact same industry where it's booming and where there's not this onerous degree of regulations? We are systematically regulating ourselves out of the market, of the most important market to our economy. But even if they appealed Bill C-69, now there's Bill C-48 that bans tanker traffic off BC's north coast. Why is it that 283 million tons of foreign oil are allowed to transit Canada's east coast, including down the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, and yet on BC's north coast, it will soon be banned? There is no scientific evidence whatsoever to suggest tanker traffic in northern BC poses a greater risk to the environment than anywhere else. It doesn't exist. And in fact, the exact opposite is true, which I'll show you later. And here's the kicker. There already are tankers off BC's north coast. 4 tankers, each filled to the brim with American oil, leave Alaska every day, transiting BC's coast, alongside the very waters where Canada's own tankers will soon be banned. It just doesn't make any sense. And one other note, building these export pipelines like Northern Gateway will dramatically increase the value of Canadian exports and thus the value of the Canadian dollar, which is another surefire way of lowering the price of gas because that's a commodity that's marketed in US dollars, as well as the cost of living in general in this country. Lastly, there's Energy East, maybe the most common sense of all the pipelines. It would take oil from existing Alberta refineries, from existing the oil sands and conventional oil in Alberta to existing refineries in the east, and help displace foreign oil currently being imported from the Middle East, North Africa, and elsewhere. But according to François Legault, Quebec's new premier, Quebecers are apparently not interested in Alberta's, quote, dirty oil. Despite the fact each day almost 43 million liters of fuel are consumed in his province for transportation alone, with sales of gasoline up over 33% since 1990. And it's not like Quebec is a stranger to the oil business, playing host to 2 large refineries, over 1,000 kilometers of pipeline, and visits from hundreds of foreign oil tankers each year. But maybe most hypocritically of all is that the fact that Quebec actually leeches off the economies of Western Canada and the very same resource industries they claim to oppose. Receiving $13 billion in equalization from provinces like Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan through federal equalization, funding their generous social programs at everybody else's expense. To oppose the construction of a pipeline so desperately needed by another part of the country under these conditions defies comprehension. And Justin Trudeau's willingness to placate his home province is even worse. Now, at least when it comes to BC's natural gas industry, there is some reason to be optimistic. The massive investment announced by LNG Canada is the single bright spot in an energy policy beset by failure after failure after failure. It is a project so large, and I was just up in Kitimat a couple weeks ago, it will employ 10,000 people during its construction and is expected to contribute over $20 billion to government revenues over the course of its lifetime. It's the single largest private investment in Canadian history. And yet some are still doing everything they can to derail the project entirely. The Green Party, under leader Andrew Weaver, has consistently sought its defeat, while radical activists funded by millions of dollars in American money, siphoned from large foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation to groups like Tides Canada, which then disperse it to Dogwood Initiative and the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, have repeatedly broken the law and flaunted a court-ordered injunction in their attempts to disrupt the feeder Coastal GasLink pipeline. This despite the fact that every elected First Nations band along the pipeline route supports it. And despite the fact that Canadian natural gas actually benefits the environment, helping Asian economies like China and India transition away from dirty coal-fired electricity. So while there are opportunities abound, our governments have, for the most part, squandered them completely. As a result, our energy industry has shed over 100,000 jobs since 2014. 100,000 jobs. Can you imagine if that was in Ontario or Quebec, where they're virtually breaking the law to save a couple hundred? There hasn't been a single inch of new pipeline built in that time. A single inch. And Eastern Canada continues to import foreign oil. At the same time, the equivalent industry in the United States continues to boom, and their exports soar for the first time in decades. And where's our leadership? Where's our Prime Minister in all of this? Apparently too busy playing dress up in India and surfing in Tofino. But you know, it didn't used to be this way. The perpetual delays, the incompetence, the political malfeasance. Leaders like John A. Macdonald, or a leader like John A. Macdonald, took just 4 years to complete the bulk of the National Railway through some of the most expansive and difficult terrain in the world in the 1880s. Can you imagine, in the current political, cultural, and regulatory climate of today, if we tried as a nation to undertake a similar feat? Instead of pushing for economic development in this country, the majority of our politicians seem to be actively plotting against it. Whereas before, government served as a willing partner with industry, today they serve as the primary vessel for its obstruction. But it doesn't have to be this way. Macdonald dreamed big. Laurier dreamed big. We can dream big once again. And the truth is, the silver lining to this problem lies in the solution. In that it's not that we need government to step up in any particular way. All we need is for government to get out of the way, to give this country back to those who built it, the people. And that begins where this country draws its greatest source of strength, the wealth of its resources and ingenuity of its citizens. Combined, these assets can make Canada an energy and resource superpower. It might start with pipelines and LNG, but this province and this country are capable of so much more. And I know from looking at the people in this room that the people are ready to play their part. The only question is the government? Thank you very much.